Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome for a second time a very accomplished and well-respected author and an expert on Korea from the UK, Dr. Michael Schluter. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Michael is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Relational Peace Building Initiatives. We'd spoken about peacekeeping and peace building in the last program, but today we're going to speak to him about his book, No Other Way to Peace in Korea, A Practical Path to Reunification of the Peninsula. So, Michael, let's come straight to the book. What motivated you to write No Other Way to Peace in Korea?
I had quite a lot of experience in international peace building prior to working on Korea. So I was involved in the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s on helping to bring an end to apartheid in South Africa. And we developed a methodology there for how to approach peace building. Then I worked in Rwanda after the genocide for 5 years to help rebuild Rwanda. Then I was involved in the war between North and South Sudan to try and help bring an end to that war, which thankfully did take place. And then more recently, we've worked on Russia and Ukraine. We're currently still working on how to bring an end to that war. So I've had experience in international peace building, but I'd met a Korean here in Cambridge through actually an Indian friend, Prabhu Guptara.
And I know Prabhu, I've interviewed him.
Yes, he's a wonderful individual and has fingers in many pies, I think, as we say. But he introduced me to a Korean who appealed to me and said, look, we've had this war in Korea, you've had experience in peace building, can't you help us bring an end to the war in Korea? That's how I got involved.
Wow. So can you share a brief overview of the plan you propose in your book for Korean reunification?
Well, many people obviously feel this is completely impossible, but as they say, you have to start somewhere. And we believe that there would be a substantial benefit to both North and South Korea if they could open up trade between them. You may remember that at the end of the Second World War, there was a threat in 1948-49 of another Third World War starting between France and Germany. And the way they resolved that, the leaders of both France and Germany at the time, was to start a trade agreement with iron and steel. The European coal and steel community is what they called it. So it was that trade agreement that gradually opened up from being about just coal and steel to being about all economic products. So from the European coal and steel community, it became the European Economic Community. And from there, it went on to being the European Community. And from there, it went to being the European Union.
Wow. Yes.
That's the history of the European Union. It all started because there was a threat of war in 1948-49. So applying the same approach here in the Korean Peninsula, we thought, well, what about a trade agreement between North and South Korea? What could it start with? Well, it could start with agriculture, because North Korea actually has quite a lot of agricultural products, fish and nuts and other things that South Korea wants. And South Korea's got a lot of food grains and meat products and so on that North Korea wants. Why not start with a Korean Peninsula agriculture community? And then work to build from there.
Very interesting. But, when you look at the two Koreas, and more recently, there, of course, has been a little bit of saber rattling going on in both sides of Korea right now.
Yes.
But, coming back to your book, Michael, what are some of the unique challenges you have identified in the context of Korean reunification compared to other conflicts?
Well, I think probably the most obvious one is the ideological challenge, in the sense that North Korea is obviously very committed to an authoritarian state. It's anti-democracy. It's also tied in with Russia in particular, and to some extent China in that sort of anti-Western bloc, whereas South Korea is very heavily committed to working with the US. They have defense agreements and so on for development of microprocessing chips and all that sort of thing. So there are strong superpower interests on both sides, but more deeply than that, there's an ideological difference between the commitment to socialism and capitalism. So that's probably been a distinguishing factor of this situation.
Very interesting. But when you come to the whole question of the ideological and political gap, given the fact that you have done work on so many different areas, do you see any similarity between West Germany and East Germany?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Obviously, there was the similarity that West Germany was very committed to capitalism and East Germany was part of the Soviet bloc.
Yeah.
Until the Soviet Union in its wider, the USSR in its wider context sort of collapsed, and you were dealing with East Germany simply as having been very heavily influenced by communist thinking. But what was different is that in the German case, you could infiltrate East Germany with Western capitalist kind of thinking through the television in particular. So the ideas, as well as the consumerism and advantages of Western capitalism, could penetrate into East Germany, so that as they watched their televisions and they saw all these West German programs, which they were unable at that time to block, a lot of East Germans began to think, well, actually, life's better over in West Germany. We should shift over to their system. Now, you can't do that in Korea, because today they can and do block all communication from South Korea. Now, it does still infiltrate into North Korea, particularly up in the northeast part of North Korea, where you get a lot of South Korean television CDs coming across the border, across the Tumen River into North Korea. But they try by every possible means to block that as well. So North Koreans really got no idea what life is like in South Korea. Many North Koreans have no idea, and they think and they're told that life is much, much worse in South Korea than it is in North Korea. So it's very difficult, therefore, to create a sort of mass movement in North Korea that says, oh, we would like something different, because they don't know about anything different, really.
Very interesting. So, Michael, you spoke a few minutes back about an agricultural exchange. What are some of the other areas that you propose that can build trust? Because I think that is lacking dramatically between the two Koreas. What can possibly be done to build trust? Because only then can you move forward.
Yes, I'm sure you're absolutely right there, that it is the building of trust that is key. And what we've basically argued along the historical lines of France and Germany is that trade offers a way to build trust, because you offer an opportunity to both sides to make money and to and in that sense to materially benefit. But in the course of that trade, they get to know each other, and actually meeting to talk about trade negotiations, you might think is a very materialistic thing, but it isn't just a materialistic thing. You learn to know people, to trust them, who to trust, and there's benefit, immediate cash benefit to both sides. So we've argued that North Korea has a lot to export to South Korea that South Korea wants. So all sorts of minerals and things South Korea imports from all over the world at the moment, it could be getting simply from North Korea, because they've got huge mineral deposits. Equally, the generals and the leaders in North Korea could benefit financially enormously if they could trade with South Korea.
Right.
Because there's a wide range of products, obviously, that South Korea produces, and the quality of life in North Korea could could advance enormously if they could trade with South Korea and just exchange their minerals and metals and so on for the South Korean product. So everybody's a winner. It's simply a higher standard of living. Now, the issue then is if the leaders can gain and become extremely wealthy out of opening up to South Korea, if the North Korean leaders can gain in that way, who's the loser? Why doesn't it kick off?
Correct.
And that, I think, is an absolutely key question.
And what are your responses to why doesn't it kick off?
Well, I think if you look at it from the point of view of Kim Jong-un in particular, he's now third generation Kim family.
Yeah.
They tried to justify their role, their power, their absolute power over society in terms of the better quality of life that they can offer than is available in South Korea. And they point to all the problems with consumerism. They point to the individualism. They point to many aspects of life in South Korea that, frankly, are not very desirable. I mean, there is an underclass in South Korea who are very, very poor, and the state does not provide anything much for them. And all right, they're a small minority, but they are significant. Also, South Korea's got the lowest birth rate in the world.
Right.
You know, they are simply wiping themselves off the planet because no one is having children.
Correct.
Well, the reasons they're not having children are quite complicated. It's that they are having to work 70 hours a week, 70 hours a week. You don't work 70 hours a week in North Korea. Well, few people do, I think. So that's a pretty big argument for not going down this Western model. And also, you know, the life of commuting into Seoul is, you know, just incredibly time consuming and miserable. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of this in Delhi. Commuting is pretty miserable.
Absolutely.
So they're saying, well, actually, has South Korea really got a better quality of life? And as they look at these things and they say, well, which is the better way to go? Health costs of health facilities are amazing in South Korea. But North Korea's death rate, actually, you know, the age expectations are not that much lower in North Korea than South Korea, because South Korea's got so much more cancer, so much more stress levels and everything else. So it becomes a more complex weighing up of, well, who has got the better lifestyle? Who has got the better system?
Correct.
You may have your political freedom, but actually, is it giving you overall a better quality of life? And for many ordinary people, it may not be.
I love this argument about, you know, the production of birth of children in South Korea being much lower, and therefore maybe there is a possibility that South Koreans may want a reunification to preserve the Korean gene pool.
Well, yes. I mean, I did some extrapolations about how quickly the workforce is declining in South Korea. So I think the workforce will be by 2065, it will be half the current level.
Wow.
So from 36 million, it'll be down to 19 million.
And that
so if you go on extrapolating that out to the end of the century, you can see that, you know, like many Asian countries, they're falling off the edge of a cliff. I mean, China has exactly the same problem as well. So the biggest problem in the world actually is the declining global population at the moment.
Correct. Well said. So moving on, Michael, what role do you see technology and media playing to promote understanding between the two Koreas?
I think one of the biggest problems in both Koreas is the education system. But if we focus briefly first on South Korea in that regard, the education system, and I have been and spoken to the government think tank on education in South Korea, which, by the way, has 500 people with PhDs working in their think tank there on this issue. And I've said to them, you know, if you go on teaching this individualistic approach to life, that actually life is all about me and my success and my career development and my wealth and all of that, if that's the foundation of your education system, it's not surprising in a way that people are not choosing to distract themselves from their career by getting married, having children. I mean, why bother to have children? It's just weighs you down. It doesn't give you any help with your career ladder, does it? It rather prevents a woman from being able to develop her career ladder. Now, if you're just teaching the women and the men in the education system that all that matters is their personal wealth and progress, it's not surprising then that they're choosing not to have children and not even to get married often.
Correct.
And also, if you make them work 70 hours a week, when have they got time to have a date?
Absolutely.
I remember speaking at a conference, and you know, I made this point to the Ministry of Commerce, I think, from Korea, and I said, or maybe it was from Singapore, because they've got the same problem in a way. And I said, you know, do you think that corporate social responsibility includes allowing time for your staff to be able to have dates and get married and have children? And the minister said, and then there was a cheer from around the edges of the room where all these young executives were sitting, because they knew this was exactly their problem. They could not find time to date and get married. And then the minister said, no, that is not our responsibility at all. You're quite cross with me for raising the subject, I think. But it certainly resonated with the young executives in the room. So,
but moving, you know, I wanted to ask you a little more macro level question, and that is that, do the major powers in the world really want a reunification? And if so, what role can they play? You know, China is a big player in North Korea, and South Korea has the US.
I think at the moment, the major powers feel that reunification would be a threat to their interests, because the US is now very heavily dependent on South Korea in its defense industries, and it has joint research projects with South Korea, particularly because of South Korea's expertise in the microprocessing sector, as it were, creating what they need for very advanced electronics for their defense industries in the US. So the way that the Koreans would have to handle it with both China as well as Russia and the US is to say that we Koreans want to be multi-connected. That's the term we've used for this idea. We want to be connected to all the superpowers. We don't want to be simply connected to the US or simply connected to China and Russia. We want to trade and work with everybody. So I think a future reunified Korea would have to make it clear that they wanted to work with everybody, including Japan too. I think that's the only way to sell it to the international community. Otherwise, the interests of the US will pull South Korea constantly away from North Korea and away from any Chinese connection and so on, and vice versa with North Korea. So that is a huge problem that they've got to address. And I think it goes deeper than simply say, oh, we will align with you, we'll do trade with you. They've got to have an ideological framework that is distinctive from either the authoritarianism of China and Russia or the sort of individualistic pattern of Western democracies. They've got to say, look, we're not committed to either of these ideological systems. We have a different ideological framework, which is fundamentally relational, and we want to relate to both of you and not be tied to either of you exclusively.
Great response. Thank you. My next question is that, you know, there is often a discussion, and, you know, when I look at whether it's India, Pakistan, whether you look at the two Germanys, whether you look at Israel and, you know, Gaza, whether you look at Ukraine, Russia, and so many other countries, a lot of discussion is often held on cultural exchange between people or people-to-people dialogue. Here, from what little I know of North Korea, and I've been to South Korea several times, North Korea is completely walled inside. My question is, how important is cultural exchange between people? And how will that be able to foster some kind of reconciliation?
On the one hand, one has to say that building trust at a grassroots level has to be very, very important. I mean, where and when would it not be important to help people simply get to know one another?
Correct.
And you might strike lucky in a way if, one of those people who today is at school in a cultural exchange meets someone from the other side and realizes that they are ordinary human beings like him or her and says, why are we at war, and then rises to some senior political position in 20, 30 years' time. It's a very long-term strategy. And of course, the influence goes from those individuals back into the families. I mean, my own child has had a cultural exchange years ago with somebody from Canada, but it built a relationship between the families, actually.
Correct.
Now, but I think being realistic, I think the problems have got to be resolved less through those sort of personal contacts where you might strike lucky between particular individuals, because only some tiny proportion will ever be involved in a cultural exchange.
Right.
I think one has got to be thinking about how does one resolve this ideological difference, because North Korea is never going to adopt capitalism, because that would be like saying the Kim family would admit that we've made this gigantic mistake for 80 years. Nor will South Korea ever adopt socialism and communism, because they've been taught and they've seen what it can do in terms of loss of personal freedom and so on, which they now value very highly. So you have to be saying, how do you bridge that ideological divide? And I think the way you bridge it is by coming up with an alternative to both of those systems and say, look, we've both got to change. We've both got to accept we've got to change. Let's agree we will all buy into a third option with this heavy emphasis on relationships, which goes into education and healthcare and the organization of your corporations and your financial management systems and everything else. But then in order to adopt that system, you have to understand actually what it means in practice. What does it look like?
Right.
And that's why we've tried to spell out what it could look like if they wanted to adopt this third option.
Well said. So I have time for two more questions for you, Michael. Given all the work that you've done on the two Koreas, I'd love to get your perspective on what are the economic implications of reunification of the Korean Peninsula to the two Koreas and maybe to the wider region.
Maybe to the whole world.
Maybe to the whole world, absolutely.
Well, they are complementary in their resource space. I mean, I'm an economist, as you know, by background. One is always looking for potential for trade between societies that have complementary resources. That may be in the skills of the workforce, or it may be in the raw materials in the ground, or in their agricultural resource potential, or whatever it may be. And there is enormous complementarity between the economies of North and South Korea, as it happens, because God, in his wisdom, put all of the minerals in North Korea. Pretty much all of them. So you have this ridiculous situation where South Korea is importing all these minerals from all over the world instead of from 100 miles north of the border with North Korea. And you just think this is, in economic terms, it's total madness.
Right.
And equally, North Korea badly needs certain kinds of foods and livestock and so on to improve the quality of life of its people, which are there in abundance in South Korea. So, South Korea's got huge surpluses of food grains and very advanced livestock breeding programs and all those things, which could so benefit the North Korean agricultural system. So there's just enormous short-term benefits and long-term benefits to the two Koreas coming together.
Well said. And my last question to you, Michael, and this is for the many, many people who will listen to our conversation. What message of hope or caution would you like to share with our audience regarding the future of the two Koreas?
That's probably your toughest question so far, I have to say.
Okay.
And I think, really, to be totally frank, coming out of my Christian worldview, I do believe there are spiritual roots and realities behind these sorts of conflicts. You can't always tie it down totally to political systems or economic benefits and realities. There are spiritual factors going on behind the scenes as well. So personally, I've been a great believer myself in the importance of prayer for peace between North and South Korea and for reunification of the peninsula. And I know that there is a very large Christian constituency in South Korea, and I know that they pray constantly for reunification of the peninsula. They've not given up at all on that dream and hope. So I'm optimistic that God in his time will answer those prayers and bring about reunification somehow, even if today we can't quite see how it's going to happen or what the necessary change would be in both the mindset in South Korea, where you've got 50% who really want it and probably 50% who've given up on hoping for it. And North Korea, where you have an elite who are gaining enormously from the current system and can't see that they could gain even more if they would open up. They're just afraid that if it opened up, some of them would be taken to the International Court in The Hague and things like that, and they dread those nightmares. They don't see the possibility they might get a Nobel Peace Prize, for example. So, but I think there is real hope. And I think one has to look at these spiritual factors underneath the surface, as well as continuing to argue for the real political and economic gains to everybody if this reunification was to take place. And I think there's a major role here for the international powers, whether it's China or Japan or Russia or the US as well, to come together and to say, look, we're all going to gain if they come together and become a multi-connected state. So why don't we offer them the opportunity?
Very well said.
To become a multi-connected country again, to reunify. We will make sure that there is immunity from prosecution for the leaders of anybody or anyone else who might be accused of what has happened under these former patterns. We will guarantee their immunity from prosecution if they will open up and agree to come together so that we can have peace in the region. So that's my dream.
Very, very well said. And on that note, Michael, thank you so much for speaking to me about your book, No Other Way to Peace in Korea, A Practical Path Through Reunification of the Peninsula. I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Dr. Michael Schluter's book. Thank you for speaking to me at such length about Korea. I loved your plan on agriculture, and it's so real. I sincerely hope people will start the initiative to at least get these two amazing nations back together again.
Thank you
again, and good luck to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.